Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the first installment of the REL Distinguished Lecture Series for the academic year 2022-23, organized by the Department of Religious Study and Religious Study Graduate Council of the University of West. My name is Miroz Sakya, Chair and Associate Professor of the Religious Study Department. Since 2020, REL Distinguished Lecture Series has contributed to broadening the educational experience of US students and the community by bringing renowned Buddhist scholars, monastics, Buddhist leaders, and influential people from all over the world to campus to encourage thought-provoking conversation and idea. Through lectures and collaborations, we strive to achieve our mission of providing a whole person education in the context informed by Buddhist wisdom and value to facilitate cultural understanding and appreciation between East and West, while also allowing the passionate and dedicated student to be exposed to a diverse and vibrant array of people, background, and idea. Today, I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Alexander O'Neill. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of East Asian Language and Culture at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, University of London. He received his PhD in religion from the University of Toronto in 2021. The title of his doctoral dissertation is Pustaka Puja, a study of sutra worship in Mahāyāna Buddhism. He is currently working on the SOAS, University of London and Cambridge University research project titled The Emergence of Ego-Phorosity, a diachronic investigation into the marking of the conscious self, funded by a UK Research and Innovation. He is also part of the NEOR online dictionary project based at the University of Toronto and the University of Virginia. He is working on a book on the topic of sutra worship. And without further ado, the topic of today's lecture is worship and recitation of Mahāyāna Sutra. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alexander O'Neill.
Thank you. So I'll just say a few words before sharing the presentation. So I'd like to thank Miraj for inviting me, and of course the University of the West for hosting this event. And in fact, in my my lifetime, my understanding of Buddhism was and also my opportunity to learn about Buddhism was originally greatly benefited greatly by contact with Fo Guangshan and the humanistic Buddhist organizations. So yeah, there's some kind of karmic connection there. And I'd also like to thank, I don't know if he's still here, Milan Chakya. He was very helpful when I was doing research on this topic in the past 5 years or so. And also here in Nepal, Deepak Bhattacharya, who I did hours of interviews with him, and he helped a lot as well. And the research for this, the funding for some of this research came from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for Canada. So I'd like to thank them as well. So without further ado, I'll just share my presentation, and just let me know if if there are any issues in terms of sound or video, because sometimes the connection here can be a bit shaky. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this presentation is called The Worship and Recitation of Mahāyāna Sūtras. So there are a lot of details that I put into this presentation, And I'll try to just go over most of this in a general way that most people can understand. And if you'd like me to go into anything in more detail later, just let me know in our question and answer period. So points of discussion, what topics will we cover today? Essentially, answer on the broadest level, what are the Mahāyāna Sūtras? How do they conceive of practice? How do they present their own worship? And what do later scriptures and commentaries say about the worship of Mahāyāna Sūtras? And how did people actually worship Mahāyāna Sūtras historically in South Asia? And how do people continue to worship them in contemporary Nepal? So by South Asia, I mean not just Nepal, but also modern day India and Bangladesh, where there were prominent Mahayana Buddhist communities, and in Nepal, where the practice of South Asian Buddhism continues. So, defining Mahayana Sutra literature, it's not too difficult, but it's worth going over some of the basics before continuing. So firstly, what is the Mahayana? So there are a lot of definitions and a lot of attempts that have been made to understand precisely what is the Mahayana. And there's not a clear consensus in academia on the history and development of the Mahayana, but I'll just go through some of the more prominent examples. Paul Harrison suggests that the Mahayana started as a loose set of non-sectarian movements beginning around the 1st century of the Common Era. So he's suggesting that in various parts of South Asia, pockets of people practicing the Mahayana emerged. However, David Drews, on the other hand, points out that within Mahayana texts, there is definitely a self-conscious awareness of what it means to be a Mahayana Buddhist and Mahayana practitioner. So he suggests that Mahayana Buddhists developed in communication with one another. And Richard Salomon showed in the Gandharan case that the Mahayana developed alongside the non-Mahayana in the same monasteries. So you would have a monastery where people were practicing what today we would call, or what Mahayanists would call Sravakayana, or practices aiming at attaining arhatship. And in that same monastery, there would be groups of people also practicing, bodhisattva practices, or Mahayana practices. In terms of its form, Richard Gombrich suggested that it first developed in written form, and I've been largely influenced by some of Richard Gombrich's arguments on that. But Jan Nattier suggests rather that there's evidence that some Mahayana sutras first developed in oral form, and actually I think there's a way to balance these two arguments. David Drews points out that in general, Mahayana practice is defined by the goal of trying to attain full Buddhahood and the Bodhisattva path, while not precluding the possibility of arhatship or pratyeka Buddhahood. So what is the traditional Buddhist perspective? So Buddhists in the first millennium would have said that, well, the Mahayana Sutras were, of course, spoken by the Buddha, memorized by Ananda, and transmitted secretly by Vajrapani, or deposited in the Naga Palace until the conditions were ripe for their re-release around Nagarjuna's time. So what are the Mahayana Sutras? So there's a few different ways in which we can identify what sutra is a Mahayana Sutra. The first is self-identification. So many of the prominent Mahayana Sutras, especially the Vaipulya, the longer Mahayana Sutras, have self-referential inclusion of the term Mahayana. So they will be discussing what is the Mahayana within the body of their text, and sometimes in the titles, something Mahayana Sutra. In terms of goal and orientation, there's an emphasis on the attainment of Buddhahood or the Bodhisattva path, in contradistinction to the attainment of arhatship or cessation at the end of this life. And there's a doctrinal emphasis on shunyata and tatata. So this is emptiness and suchness. So an example of this would be the Prajnaparamita texts. And there's also a presentation of a view of the world as a misapprehension due to adventitious stains on pure consciousness. And that's, for example, something that the Lankavatara Sutra suggests. And the Tathagatagarbha Sutra literature suggests that there's an equation between the true body of the Buddha, the Dharmakaya, and suchness, tatata, and also emptiness. And that this is something which is always present, but because of adventitious stains on one's consciousness, one doesn't notice this. One doesn't have awareness of suchness. And then there's also this doctrine of provisional teachings in distinction to conditional, in distinction to ultimate teachings, and also the idea of conditional manifestations in distinction to the true form of the Buddha, for example. So the distinction between provisional teachings and ultimate teachings means that in certain circumstances, the Mahāyāna Sūtras suggest that the Buddha says certain words, certain teachings to suit the inclinations of beings' minds. So to certain beings, the Buddha is suited to manifesting in such a form that he teaches the Shravakyana teachings. In certain circumstances, he manifests in such a form that he teaches the Mahayana teachings. In certain circumstances, he manifests as a Buddha. In other circumstances, he appears as a monk, as a nun, etc. So these are some of the features of Mahayana Sutras. And within the genre of Mahayana Sutras, the Prajnaparamita or Prajnaparamita is a subgenre because it has a distinct set of themes, styles, and doctrines. And there are two branches identified by Kanza. The first one is what many people would say the Ashtasahasrika is the root of the first branch, and that there are longer versions of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, such as the Shatasahasrika, the Perfection of Wisdom in 100,000 shlokas, lines. And Jan Nattier suggests that material was gradually added to these over time. So there are some theories that the Ashtasahasrika, for example, or parts of it, were a original core and that this was expanded on. The traditional view represented by Haribhadra was the opposite, that the original version of the Prajnaparamita was the Shatasahasrika, and that the shorter versions were made for people who had shorter attention spans or who delighted in titles and section headings. And then the second branch are original texts on the same theme, such as the Diamond Sutra, Vajracchedika, and also the Prajnaparamita and Dharani literature. Let's see if there's, okay, so how do the Mahayana Sutras conceive of practice in terms of bodhisattva conduct? So maybe before introducing the Mahayana version of bodhisattva conduct, what is the non-Mahayana conception? So in the great treatise on the perfection of wisdom, there is some discussion about what characterizes the non-Mahayana approach to the bodhisattva path. And so these are things that Shravakyana texts, Nikaya and Agama texts, when they're discussing the bodhisattva path, and Mahayana texts, when they're discussing the bodhisattva path, have in common. So they both have these in common. So firstly, a prediction is necessary. So for example, Shakyamuni Buddha in his previous existence is said to have received a prediction of his Buddhahood from Dipankara. So all bodhisattvas need to have this prediction of their Buddhahood. And in order to produce the 32 marks that characterize a Buddha's body, they're supposed to perform meritorious actions which correspond to those marks. And so for Shakyamuni, it's said to have taken 91 kalpas to complete and perfect all those marks, and perfecting the 6 paramitas, or 10 paramitas, depending on the scheme. So for example, King Shibi, the story of King Shibi, which you might know, or Vishvantara, and this picture on the left is an illustration of the King Shibi Jataka, where he gives up his flesh to Indra in the form of there's a Indra and one of his subordinate devas are disguised as a hawk and a pigeon, or some kind of bird, and they say, "Oh, if you don't give up your flesh, we will." The hawk will eat the small bird. So King Shibi gives up whatever flesh is asked, and at the end, Indra says, "Oh." Just before King Shibi is about to die, he says, "Oh, you obviously are developing the perfection of giving. I'm going to restore all of your flesh and put you back to normal." So that's an example of the kind of thing that a bodhisattva is expected to do to develop something like the perfection of giving. It's not normal giving. It's not like just handing out a coin to somebody. It's giving your whole life. And then, of course, a bodhisattva is supposed to have a penultimate life in Tushita. So as Shvetaketu Bodhisattva, Shakyamuni was living in Tushita, gives a teaching to the Devas, and then descends to the Saha world and turns the wheel of Dharma, and then finally manifests, passing into Nirvana. Now, on the Mahayana side, they suggest the arousal of bodhicitta as fundamental, bodhicittotpada. And then there are some distinctions, some attainments, which are found in common in discussions of bodhisattva practice in Mahayana Sutras, in addition to what we see in the non-Mahayana texts. So one of them is this idea of patience at the non-origination of all dharmas. So, for example, in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, it says if a bodhisattva hears the perfection of wisdom and doesn't tremble, they don't have any fear. They are known to be practicing the perfection of wisdom. They can accept that dharmas neither arise nor cease, and they're not afraid at hearing that in fact they don't really exist in the way that they thought they did. And then this other feature is very important, the attainment of non-retrogression. So there are certain features which characterize a bodhisattva who's not going to progress on the path. The accumulation of merit and wisdom, and then on the one hand, temporal unreachability. So it's still emphasized that it would take countless kalpas to perfect the 10 stages and attain the 6 paramitas. But on the other hand, there's this idea of the inseparability of the bodhisattva's body, speech, and mind with that of the Buddhas, as suggested by the Tathagata Guhya, and inherent awakening. So there is always a strain of instant enlightenment in Mahayana thought, that there's a way to cut right through to one's Buddha nature. And then there's this idea of manifestation of bodhisattvas and Buddhists in the world in practical, physical, and verbal form. So for example, in the Manjushriya Mulakalpa, it suggests that bodhisattvas, they take on the form of speech, of words, in order to manifest in the world and help beings. So they take on the form of dharanis, vidyas, mantras. And this is informed in the first place by self-referential instructions to worship. So for example, the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the Ashtasasrika itself identifies itself as the Dharmakaya, as the Dharma body, and as mantra, as a mantra or a vidya, sacred speech, sacred utterance, so that the words of the sutra themselves are the true body of the Buddha. So you can manifest the true body of the Buddha in the world in the form of sacred speech. such as mantras or dharanis. And the Manjushri and Mulakalpa suggests that this is done out of compassion, that bodhisattvas manifest in these forms. And when they manifest in female form, they're usually referred to as vidya. So we have, for example, the Vidya Devis include, for example, the Pancharaksha Devis, the 5 protectors, goddesses, and of course, Pragya Paramita in Devi form, in goddess form, the perfection of wisdom in goddess form. So how do Mahāyāna Sutras present their own worship? Well, here are some illustrations. This is from the Orissa State Museum. This is the base of a stele, which illustrates devotees worshiping a manuscript. And here you can see some ritual items. We have some lamps and other goods. And here's another relief of what appears to be a monk offering a manuscript, Dharmadana. So how do the Mahāyāna Sutras present this kind of worship, if indeed Mahāyāna Sutras were worshipped? And firstly, why were they worshipped? So going back to that previous point I made, that it's conceived of as, the sutras are conceived of as being the embodiment of bodhisattvas and Buddhas in the world in physical form. It becomes important to honor them in the same way you would honor a Buddha image or a Chaitya, because that becomes the true body of the Buddha. And it's also portable. You can take it anywhere, whereas a Chaitya is stuck in one place. So there are a number of types of injunctions. So injunctions are kind of instructions to suggest that you do something. So what type of injunctions are there in, for example, the Ashtasahasrika? So actions involving the idealized subject in relation to the sutra involves, for example, the sutra saying the son of good family or daughter of good family, or the ideal monk or nun will take up, bear, recite, study, and spread this sutra to others, and that the merit of doing that would be greater than a creating a 7-jeweled Tathagata Dhatu Garbha Stupa, or filling the entire Trikiliocosm with 7-jeweled Tathagata Dhatu Garbha Stupas and offering it to all the Buddhas. And then actions involving teaching the sutra to others involves precisely that. So saying the son of good family or daughter of good family should teach, should recite, should explain in detail to others this sutra. Worshipping the spot of earth on which the sutra is placed is kind of going back to that theme that I mentioned with Chaitya worship. So while Buddhists, of course, Mahayana Buddhists, of course, continue to worship Chaityas, the Mahayana Sutras identify themselves as the Chaitya Bhutto, the true Chaitya, and the true body of the Tathagata. So, so that means that the spot of earth on which the sutra is placed, it becomes identified as a true Chaitya, and all beings who come there would be protected. So it says, for example, the Ashtasahasrika suggests the son of good family or daughter of good family should in fact worship that spot of earth. And then setting up the sutra for worship with various offerings, there's a ritual scenario that we find in a lot of Mahayana sutras, which suggests, somewhat like in this picture, that the son of good family or daughter of good family should set up for worship the sutra, should offer it incense, lights, lamps, flags, banners, bells, flowers, robes, aromatic powders, ointments, and manifold pujas. And that's pretty much what we see in this kind of illustration and what we see in contemporary Nepal to a certain extent. So preserving and protecting the sutra, these are just injunctions about making sure that the sutra is protected. So the son of good family or daughter of good family who would uphold and protect this sutra, preserve it, for example, will accumulate such and such a great amount of merit. Inspecting and inquiring further about the sutra. But then some of the interesting passages include passages related to making the sutra into a book. So even in the earliest Mahāyāna Sutras, we see instructions to turn the sutra into a book, make it into a manuscript, Pustaka Gata. And in the conclusion of the Ashtasasraka, it suggests, or the Buddha suggests to Ananda, that he should write it well with very distinct letters in a Greek book, and then set it up for worship with the incense, flags, bells, banners, lights, and so forth on all sides, and worship it with manifold pujas. So it's quite clear what kind of worship the Mahāyāna Sutras suggest. And this is kind of more of a statistical look, but just trying to figure out how common is the worship of Mahāyāna Sutras, or how common are injunctions to the worship of sutras in Mahāyāna literature. So just doing a survey of about 40 representative Mahāyāna Sutras, I found that these passages occur in 24 out of 40. So the categories include practicing and propagating the text, making it into a book, preserving the text's longevity, boons, lists of boons from practicing and worshiping the text, self-identification of the text with something else. So for example, Pragya Paramita is identified as the mother of all Buddhas, the mother of all Bodhisattvas. Qualifications and roots. So someone who encounters the sutra is said to have certain roots of merit in order to encounter the sutra in the first place. And entrustment passages. These are passages at the end of sutras, which where the Buddha entrusts the sutra to one of his disciples. So these are all self-referential passages, which refer to the sutra within the text of the sutra. So these are materials that you would probably expect in other literatures to be in commentaries or ritual manuals, but in fact, in Mahāyāna Sutras, they're within the body of the text itself. So they are a fundamental part of Mahāyāna doctrine and practice. So I'll just read the titles of the sutras. I won't go into all of the contents. Time is limited. So the Ashtasasraka, of course. We have the Siddharma Pundarika. So those are the two sutras with the greatest number of passages. Then the Suvarna Prabhasa, Sangata, Samadhi Raja, Sarvadhatthagata Adi Sthana Vyuha, Mahasahasra. Well, anyway, you can read you can read the rest. You can see that this is a very common theme in Mahāyāna Sutras. There are some interesting ones as well. Aparamitayu or Paramitayas is, you could say, 95% self-referential passages. It's very interesting. And here's the last. So Shorter Sukhavati Vyuha has just a bit. And then within the Ashtasasraka, there is, we can have a look at the distribution of these passages within the sutra. And this has some implications for Ur-Sutra theories, I think, because we see a concentration in the first half, particularly in the third Parivarta, the third chapter. And then after the 16th chapter, these really trail off. So this is something that we can discuss later if anyone's interested, but I'll move on because it's not the topic of this discussion. So historic worship of Mahāyāna Sutras. So how do we know that these instructions were actually followed through in practice? Well, there are a few ways that we can do that. One of them is looking at the reports of pilgrims uh, to India and Nepal. So Fashion reports on daily offerings to Pragya alongside offerings to various bodhisattvas. The Susiddhikara Sutra prescribes worship in an abbreviated Pragya recitation, and the term used for abbreviated Pragya recitation is interesting because um, it actually appears to be related to this practice of tendoku, which we see in Japan. So this idea of abbreviating the recitation of long sutras is something which goes back to the first millennium. So the Shatasahasraka Pragya, for example, if you recite it from cover to cover, it's going to take you months to finish. But if you can split it up into sections, then you can have multiple people recite it at the same time, and you can finish in a few hours. Well, that's taken to maybe it's a logical conclusion in Japan, where they just recite the title and depending on the sect, a mantra, and fan the manuscript open and then closed, and that counts as a recitation. So there are lots of abbreviated recitation strategies, and we'll see some from Nepal in a moment. So the Chanda Mahaghoshana Tantra suggests the worship of the Pragya Paramita in itself. And there are lots of commentarial references saying that bodhisattva practice involves the worship and recitation of Mahāyāna Sūtras. So we see it in the Shiksha Samuccaya Pustaka Patopaya, which is it only exists in Tibetan, but it's a kind of a brief manual for the worship of pustakas, worship of manuscripts. Vimala Prabha, commentary on the Tantric commentary, and the Kritrishti Nirgatana mentions it. So then a bit later than that material, we are looking at Adikarma literature. So Adikarma literature is a literature for essentially trainee or beginner bodhisattvas. So the Adikarma literature often mentions a recitation and worship of the Pragya Paramita and other Mahāyāna Sutras. So Adikarma Pradipa, for example, suggests that bodhisattvas, Adikarmika bodhisattvas, will recite the Pragya Paramita along with other sutras. So what these other sutras are, it doesn't mention. But there are some sets that we find in other locations. So for example, the Manjushriya Mulakampa has this kind of arrangement of 4 sutras, the Samadhi Raja, Gandha Vyuha, Suvarna Vasa, and Pragya Paramita. And this is like a very small, you could say a very small canon of sutras that they seem to think are not only essential but associated with the 4 directions. And this is used for for example, consecrating a monastery with sutras associated in 4 directions. The Kriya Samuccaya then starts to kind of, whether it builds on that theme or if it's just doing something from scratch, I'm not sure, but they do have a similar Dharma mandala of esoteric tantras, so secret tantras. So here, this is what the Kriya Samuccaya suggests, that in the center, you would place a Yogini Ritura Tantra, followed by the other classes of Tantra. Which specific texts you would use aren't specified, but this is a mandala which is made as a preliminary to Acharya Abhisheka. So it's for esoteric initiation. And then what we find later is a adaptation of the same formula, the same ritual formula, but where we see tantras in the Kriya Samuccaya, later Poshada manuals from Nepal supplement the tantras for exoteric sutras. So that means we start seeing these tantras replaced by sutras, Mahāyāna sutras. So not secret sutras, they are ones which anybody can read. So this is what we see in contemporary Dharma mandalas. The Pragyaparamita is always in the center. Then the Lankavatara, Lalitavistara, Lankavatara, Suvarnaprabhasa, Gandhabhyuha, Sudharma Pundarika, let me just make this here, Dashabhumika, Tathagata Guhyaka, which is usually supplemented by the Guhya Samaja. And yeah, maybe I should have started Samadhi Raja, of course. So this is what you see in contemporary Pushada practices. For example, if you're doing Ashtami Vrata, this would be something that would be drawn. So contemporary sutra worship and recitation in Nepal, I would say that this is something which is contiguous with the medieval practices and classical practices that we saw in various texts. But there are also some changes. So I'm just going to play a video first so that you get an idea of what this kind of recitation is like. This is a recitation of the Pancharaksha Sutras. It's Pancharaksha Sutra, which has 5 sections. This is just a short clip. So maybe that gives you an idea of the character of sutra recitation and a little bit of sutra worship in contemporary Nepal. So here you see the remnants of where the sutra was worshipped, and recitation is done simultaneously. So we see folios of a manuscript being split and divided between reciting priests, Vajracharyas. And so I would suggest that this is one of the abbreviation strategies that we see presaged perhaps in the Susiddhikara. And so this practice in Nepal is called Pa Tyakegu, which is a kind of popular rendition of Pata Yakegu, which means to make recitation, to make pata. And pata means recitation. So Sutra Pata Puja is the worship or the ritual of sutra recitation. So I'm just going to give a brief generalized outline of what happens, and I can show you a bit of a more detailed look in a moment. But just to frame before, Sutra Pata is different in many different temples, many monasteries in Nepal. So however I characterize it, it shouldn't be taken as normative. It's just how it generally might look. So one of the main things to keep in mind is that there's usually a Guti organization. So a Guti is a hereditary, kind of like a hereditary guild. Membership is usually hereditary. And so, for example, in many monasteries, who has the right to recite a certain sutra might be based on your membership in a Guti in these hereditary guilds, but not always the case. So usually there's a primary officiant, a mula guru, root guru, and reciters. And there's usually a frame ritual, which consists of the Guru Mandala Puja and a Sankalpa Pujas. So Guru Mandala Puja is something which has many Vajrayana elements, and it's something which I'm not going to go into so much detail here, but essentially you can't just open a sutra and read it like you would open a book in the library and start reading. You have to do this kind of frame ritual and invite deities to be present to protect the reading and also to ensure that it's successful. There are also some Kalpa Pujas, and so these involve not only calling various deities to witness, but also making a solemn pledge that as a sponsor, you're going to remain for the puja and that you're going to dedicate the merit to a certain purpose. So you could name certain people that you would like to dedicate their merit to, or some people might have a certain goal in mind. Then the folios are divided, and when recitation is occurring, the sponsor is usually asked to do what's called Chaka Puja, which is worship of various deities in the monastery. And if it's not in a monastery, if it's in a house, usually the sponsor will go to the rooftop terrace and worship deities around the city. When recitation is finished, there'll be certain rituals for the dismissal of deities. Stipends, payment will be exchanged, and prasad will be given. So prasad is essentially something that is distributed at the end of pujas. So usually it's there's some fruit, sinha or tika, and sacred thread, either Rakta Sutra, red thread, or Pancha Sutra, a 5-colored thread. And then generally fasting is required until the end of the puja, like with lots of pujas. So this is another chart which is kind of giving a more detailed analysis of aspects of the puja. So on the left-hand side, we have parts of the puja, what the purpose is, the deities involved, the ritual implements involved, and any texts or mantras, dharis that are involved. So this is more or less, these are more or less the aspects of the puja which we see in Sutrapata as it occurs in Lalitpur in Nepal. This is not necessarily something that would hold true from monastery to monastery. So this is just a general example. And in Kathmandu, for example, much of this will take on a bit of a different form. In many ways, it's shorter in Kathmandu. So I won't go into the details because it's not necessary, but just so you get an idea of how complicated Sutrapata is. There's so many different aspects and so many mantras involved. So yes, at the end there's a feast which is modeled on Gana Chakra or Tantric feast to satisfy both participants and deities. So in terms of variations, on the upper right, you see at Okubaha, they have recitation of the Prajnaparamita, but rather than being the hereditary rite of Vajracharyas, during the month of Gundla, after the text is worshipped and the opening puja is performed by Vajracharya from Binche Baha, the Shakyas from Okubaha are the ones who do the recitation. So it's not done by Vajracharya priests. And just for those who are not familiar, Vajracharyas are tantric priests, tantric teachers, Vajra teachers, and Shakyas are people who have the hereditary role of monk in Nepal. There are some other variations on Pachakegu, such as Navagranta Sutrapata. So this is the 9 sutras that make up the Dharma Mandala. If they are all recited together, then it's called Navagranta Sutrapata. And that usually requires at least 108 Vajracharyas to perform. And it only occurs on very rare occasions. It's quite expensive to sponsor such a thing. And similarly with the Shata Sahasraka Prajnaparamita, it requires many, many priests to recite. So it only happens once in a while. But there are occasions when it does happen. This is a example. Let's see if it loads. This is an example of a Navagranta Sutrapata, just so you have an idea of what it looks like. So this was a which combined both the Nava Sutapata and another major book. So here you see the 9 sutras. This is what it looks like. It's very different from just simple sutra recitation. That's just what it's like when they're being muted. Worship. So they're still in the performing the yoga breath. Here. And let's see if we can see where it's being used. I think the connection is not so good, so it's not loading very quickly. Okay, let's move on. I can show you later. I can send you the link if you're interested. So maybe to conclude, so in Nepal, we do see abbreviation strategies. So are these historical continuities or are they divergences? I think they probably began quite a while ago because these sutras are long and you can't just recite them from cover to cover just at a whim. But there are definitely Vajrayana influenced elements like Guru Mandala Puja, Sankalpa, Ganachakra. These are things which we did not see in the Mahayana Sutra injunctions themselves. These are things which require developments of Vajrayana and the Vajracharya priesthood to kind of innovate. We have, these are some of the implements that we have, which are mentioned in the sutras. Such as powder, perfume, fragrances, garlands, incense, flowers. But we very rarely, or I've never seen flags. Of course, bells are used for rituals, but banners, parasols, robes, and only a few lamps. So what we are seeing is people are not trying to just practice what is said in the sutra. The ritual is taking on its own form and constantly evolving, and that's legitimate in and of itself. And we also have continuities with the worship of, for example, Pancharaksha devis. Another important aspect is in Nepal, all manuscripts that are recited have life installed, jiva, pratishta, so placement of life. You can't just recite, you can't just do Sutrapata with a book from the library. It has to be something that has been consecrated. And so I have some theories about what's happening, whether the developments in Sutrapata are something which developed during the medieval period in Nepal to legitimate as part of legitimation strategies or Vana era reform or retraditionalization, but I won't go into that because it's getting a bit long. And then asking the question about how Vajrayana is sutra worship in Nepal. And I would say, so essentially sutra worship and recitation remains entirely exoteric. So it remains entirely public. It's the primary form of Mahayana practice. And it's the primary form of practicing Mahayana worship, even in the Mahayana sutras. So in fact, if we look at the Pragya-paramita, it only mentions samadhi or meditation maybe 4 or 5 times, but it mentions sutra worship 600 times. So sutra worship is how you practice Pragya-paramita in addition to samadhi and of course realizing suchness. That's important, but how do you do it? How do you practice on a day-to-day level? It's sutra worship, and that continues in contemporary Mahayana in Nepal. And we should get beyond this idea of associating mantra and dharani practice only with the Vajrayana. Mantra and dharani practice is something which we find in Mahayana going way back to before the Vajrayana. It's commonplace. But of course, if it's something that requires initiation, abhisheka, it's tantric. So Vajrayana and the Mahayana, they are mutually soteriologically sufficient. What this means is, on the one hand, the Mahayana sutras, they still have they still have within them a method that they claim will take you all the way to Buddhahood, and Vajrayana has the same thing. So these are two streams that run alongside one another, and there's no conflict by doing that. There's no contradiction. People don't say, oh, well, why would we recite Mahāyāna Sūtras because we have the Tantras? We should get rid of the, no, it has to continue. These are two tracks which continue alongside each other. One does not just supersede the other. So, this kind of narrative of Vajrayana superseding and being superior to the Mahayana in some way is a myth. That's in brief the worship of Mahāyāna Sutras, both historically and in contemporary Nepal. So I hope that wasn't too much of an overload of information, but I'm looking forward to your questions. So I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Alex, for a wonderful talk. You have done so much work on this area. I cannot wait to read your dissertation or the published book in future. So we have a few minutes left, and let's open up. Let's take some question from the audience. And I saw some question here already posted on the chat box. So we have today some professor and a student from Sugat Buddhist College from Nepal, and Professor Sanjay. He asked question here. What are the difference you found between the recitation processes in Nepal in comparison with other countries? Does the recitation is for listener as well?
So the first question, the closest I think is probably Tendoku in Japan, which is because we see the division of the folios of this massive sutra into many different sections, and then an abbreviated recitation. So rather than reading from cover to cover, to compare, for example, to Mahayana recitation in Chinese Buddhism. In Chinese Buddhism, we almost always see everybody reciting together from beginning to end. And if the sutra is too long, then for example, they'll recite one folio, one scroll, and then take up the second scroll the next day, for example. So in Theravada, we see a similar thing. There will be in the Sutta Bhanika practice of sutta memorization, there are recitation sections to longer sutras. So they would just recite from beginning to end to, for example, the middle of a longer sutra, and then take up the second section in the second part. So this is really something we only see in Mahayana, and interestingly enough, the practices in Japan are also things which are occurring in a context where there is also Vajrayana alongside Mahayana. So in Shingon and Tendai Buddhism, we see the coexistence of Mahayana and Vajrayana like we do in Nepal. In Tibet, it's not so, sutra recitation is not prioritized, but it does happen. And so the question as regards who is the sutra recitation for is a fantastic question. There are many ways to answer that. On the most practical level, the sutra recitation is for the sponsor. So the reason why the sutra recitation occurs is because there's someone who can donate to pay for the lunch, the stipends, for all of the goods required for the sutra. Because if the priests had to do it themselves, there would be a deficit, and there would be no resources going towards this practice. So it's actually important that there are sponsors for these practices. However, of course, we have to think in terms of bodhicitta. The goal of the recitation from the Mahayana perspective is the benefit of all beings. So, of course, the Sankalpa specifies a specific intent, So you could say, well, recovering from illness, or I dedicate the merit to my mother, or to safe travel. But ultimately, it's for all beings, sarva-sattva hita, benefit of all sentient beings. And of course, the wish that they all attain Buddhahood. So and then another level is in terms of I would say the sonic level. So sonic means sound level. Beings in the vicinity, people and animals, and unseen beings, nagas and yakshas and what have you. Everyone hears the sound, the vibrations of the sutra recitation, and that has an effect in creating sacred space. And so there actually are, this is something which I didn't get into because it's too complicated, but there are two kinds of agency or power of sutra recitation. One of them is the power of the Buddha that is inside the actual sutra, that is placed in the sutra in pratishta, so the power of the Pancha-Buddha. And then the other one is the power inherent in the text. So for example, if you recite a sutra which has not been empowered, which has not undergone pratishta, there is still power from the recitation because it's the word of the Buddha. But if it's undergone pratishta, then there's both the power of the recitation and the power of the deity within the text. So that's why it's better. That's why it's always done with empowered texts. But beings will benefit without wanting to be benefited.
Thank you. Next question from Andrew. Can you speak a little bit about your comment that the position that some early Mahayana were transmitted or composed orally, and the contrary position that they were written down can be reconciled? I've heard some say that the early Mahayana Sutras may have been the first written Buddhist text. Is that consistent with our modern academic understanding, and have we validated the theory that their self-referential worship injunction were possibly influenced by a rivalry with the stupa cult?
Yeah. So in regard to the first question, whether they were the first Buddhist, let me just see, country written down can be reconciled. Mahāyāna Sūtras.
It has multiple.
So in terms of what was the first Buddhist text, what were the first Buddhist texts to be put into writing? Of course, the Theravada tradition says that because there was a epidemic in Sri Lanka in the 1st century before the Common Era, they put it into writing. They put the Pali Tipitaka into writing. But of course, we don't have Pali manuscripts going back that long. So the oldest Buddhist manuscripts are all Mahāyāna Sutras, primarily from Gandhara. So the idea that they were put into writing as they were composed is very legitimate. And in fact, Paul Harrison has suggested just that, and so has Gombrich. But I think there are elements, and we don't have time to get into it, but I think there are elements of oral recitation in oral composition in the Ashtasahasrika, for example, and Jan Natir has shown that there's evidence of oral composition in other sutras. So I don't think it's necessarily an either or situation. What I would suggest rather is that writing was a complement to the oral tradition. Orality was always important, and memorization was always important in Mahayana Buddhism, as it was in non-Mahayana Buddhism. But what manuscripts could do is provide a kind of store of a repository and also a reference that people could use to check their recitations, to check their memorization, and also to use as an object for worship. So there are accounts of, I'm trying to recall where it was from. I think it might have been Bashian or Xuanzang who said there was such and such a monk in Nalanda who had memorized the Shata Sahasraka Pragya Paramita, for example. So this was happening in the second half of the first millennium. But of course, literacy developed and the need to memorize dropped off. And then in regard to the second aspect, self-referential worship injunctions, I do think are a way to secure the position of the Mahāyāna Sutras in contrast to the stupa worship or chaitya worship. So chaitya, the Sutra Banaka practices for non-Mahāyāna practices, non-Mahāyāna texts rather, were centered around chaityas and worship of chaityas. So what the Mahāyāna could do is change the focus to the sutras. Not saying that chaityas should not be worshipped. They never say that, but rather saying that this is something which is very important. And of course, then by emphasizing writing, they don't have to rely on Sutra Banaka practices. They don't have to rely on this infrastructure of memorization. So for example, for the Agamas and Nikayas, you need to have a lineage of hundreds of thousands of monks memorizing every section of the Durga Agama, Madhyama Agama, and so forth. Well, with the Mahāyāna Sutras, you don't need to have that kind of infrastructure. Of course, people will try to memorize them, but all you really need is you have to develop an infrastructure rather of scribes, which is of course more specialized than, I'm not saying it's more specialized actually, it's specialized in a different way than recitation. It's a different technology. Recitation and memorization is also a technology. And there's a book by Paul Griffiths on religious reading, and he goes into recitation as a kind of orality as a kind of literacy. And that, of course, has been criticized by people like people who might take the view like Walter Ong, that orality should never be considered literacy. And I kind of agree with Ong, but I think that Griffiths has some good points, that recitation and memorization do have a form of storage. So by memorizing texts, you can, in a way, store them, and you can recall and refer back to them like you would a book. But they shouldn't be equated as being, orality is not just another kind of literacy. They are very different, and they have a different effect on your mind, on your perception of the world. And well, it's a big topic, and it's in my dissertation, and there's a whole chapter on this topic of orality and literacy. When I can publish it as a book, hopefully I'll be able to just refer you to chapter 2. But thank you for that very difficult question.
Thank you, Alex. So last question, I want to ask one question. So in your paper, I read the sutra worships among Newar highlights the presence of the divine in the text. So have you found any other earliest evidence of worship of sutra in East Asian Buddhist tradition beside Nepal?
Yeah, certainly. By early, do you mean
early evidence of the worship?
Yes. Well, I think just for example, in Japan, Emperor Shotoku decreed that every temple has to recite the Savarna Prabhasa for the welfare of the state. So this is something which was happening in East Asia as well, and it was seen that this does have a real effect on the world. So Emperor Shotoku was doing this not only to protect the kingdom, but also to help the emperor recover from illness. And we see the same thing in China. I mean, especially for what we would call the apotropaic or kind of medicinal and worldly benefit of recitation. So in China, for example, it's very much, we very much see it in terms of protecting the state, for the benefit of the kingdom. And of course, that's something which in Japan, in China, maybe very, very briefly, but in Japan, it really took off, or rather, you could say Tantra or Vajrayana really took over from the Mahayana after a certain period. So eventually we start seeing the emperors relying on Tendai and Shingon practices for that kind of effect. But early on with, for example, Shotoku, we see it with just recitation of Suvarna Prabhasa or something. Whereas in Nepal, the great thing is that we see this, like I mentioned, this kind of continuity of these two streams together, and coexistence of Mahayana Vajrayana, which is nice. Of course, we see that in Japan too, but it's something which is very, I think in Nepal it's very pure in that sense. Of course, there are influences, like I pointed out. So Mahayana sutra worship is, encompassed within the frameworks of Vajrayana and Vajracharya infrastructure.
Thank you. That makes it very clear. And so there's no more questions. So we're going to end. So once again, thank you, Alex, for an insightful talk. And I'm happy to announce that the more distinguished guest speaker, Professor Marek Major from University of Warsaw and Professor Punni Parajali are scheduled to give a talk in the next few months. So stay tuned. And at last, I would like to thank Venerable Srinanda, the President of Religious Studies Graduate Council, and our MA student Samantha Vargas for their assistance in organizing this event. And thank you everyone for attending. Have a good night.
Thank you.